The Sega Genesis, known as the Mega Drive outside North America, is a 16-bit fourth-generation home video game console developed and sold by a company called Sega. The Genesis was Sega's third console and successor to the Master System. It was released in 1988 in Japan as the Mega Drive, 1989 in North America as the Genesis, and 1990 in Europe as the Mega Drive. Designed by an R&D team supervised by Hideki Sato and Masahiro Ishikawa, the Genesis was adapted from Sega's System 16 arcade board and would go on to play a library of more than 900 games on ROM-based cartridges. In Japan, the Mega Drive fared poorly against its two main competitors, Nintendo's Super Famicom and NEC's PC Engine, but achieved considerable success in North America, Brazil, and Europe. Contributing to its success was its library of arcade game ports, the popularity of Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog series, several popular sports franchises, and aggressive youth marketing that positioned it as the cool console for adolescents. The 1991 North American release of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System triggered a fierce battle for market share in the United States and Europe known as the Console War. This drew attention to the video game industry and the Genesis.
Sonic 2 handles stubborn stains, embarrassing bald spots, no problem. It even slices and dices. Buy the Sega Genesis that comes with Sonic 1 and get Sonic 2 free. Act now.
By the way, this is Reading Wikipedia, where I something Wikipedia. History. Development. In the early 1980s, Sega Enterprises Inc. was one of the top 5 arcade game manufacturers active in the United States, but a downturn in the arcade business starting in 1982 led to corporate stuff to happen.
Yeah.
There was Sega's North American R&D operation as well as its Japanese subsidiary, Sega Enterprises Ltd. So the arcade business was in decline. Sega of Japan President Hayao Nakayama advocated that the company leverage its hardware expertise to move into the home console market, which was a fairly new market. In July 1983, Sega released its first home video game system in Japan, the SG-1000, and while its success had exceeded Sega's expectations, home console sales were dominated by Nintendo's Famicom, which had been released the same day. The Famicom is what North Americans would know as the Nintendo Entertainment System, over 2 years before it would be released as such, so yeah, Nintendo's console was just better than Sega's in every way at that point. Sega estimated that the Famicom outsold the SG-1000 10-1. The SG-1000 was replaced by the Sega Mark III 2 years later, so by October 1985. In 1986, Sega redesigned the Mark III for release in North America as the Master System. This was followed by a European release the next year. Although the Master System was a success in Europe and later Brazil, it failed to ignite significant interest in the Japanese or North American markets, which by the mid to late 1980s were both dominated by Nintendo, with Sega continuing to have difficulty penetrating the home market. Sega's console R&D team, led by Masahiro Ishikawa and supervised by Hideki Sato, began work on a successor to the Master System almost immediately after that console launched. In 1987, Sega faced another threat to its console business when Japanese computer giant NEC released the PC Engine amid great publicity. To remain competitive against the two more established consumer electronics companies, Ishikawa and his team decided they needed to incorporate a 16-bit microprocessor into their new system to make an impact in the marketplace, and once again turned to Sega's strengths in the arcade industry to adapt the successful Sega System 16 arcade board into architecture for a home console. The appearance of the Mega Drive was designed by a team led by Masuji Shiriwa that drew inspiration from audio equipment and automobiles. Shiriwa said that this more mature look helped to target the Mega Drive to all ages, unlike the Famicom, which was aimed primarily at children. Which is also why the NES was designed in the US to look more living room conventional, like a VCR, so parents would accept it into their decor. The console was announced in the June 1988 issue of the magazine Beep as the Mark V, but Sega management wanted a stronger name. After reviewing more than 300 proposals, the company settled on Mega Drive, but in North America, the name was changed to Genesis. Rosen said he insisted on the name as he disliked Mega Drive and wanted to represent a new beginning for Sega. Also, the name may have been trademarked here?
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, it was?
Yeah.
Well, there you go. History. Launch. Sega released the Mega Drive in Japan on October 29, 1988, though the launch was overshadowed by Nintendo's release of Super Mario Bros. 3 a week earlier. Fucking Nintendo. Within 2 days of release, the console's initial production run sold out. However, Sega only managed to ship 400,000 units the first year, which, I don't know, is that not a lot for the 80s?
I don't know.
In order to increase sales, Sega released various peripherals and games, including an online banking system and answering machine called the Sega Mega Answer. Nevertheless, in spite of those bad business decisions, the Mega Drive was unable to overtake the venerable Famicom and remained a distant third in Japan behind Nintendo's Super Famicom and NEC's PC Engine throughout the 16-bit era. So we just jumped from 1989 to the entirety of the Mega Drive's existence in Japan, so it should be noted that making good games was a strategy that was tried. They just weren't like, this video game system would have done great had we just gotten the banking app right. Okay, now on to North America. Sega did not possess a North American sales and marketing organization and was distributing its Master System through Tonka. Dissatisfied with Tonka's performance, probably because they were too preoccupied with pushing all those trucks. The joke is that they're known for selling toy trucks, and that's all they know how to do. So Sega tried Atari, but Atari just Atari'd it up. Fucking Atari. The joke is that Atari messed up a lot in the 80s. So through the magic of corporate whatever, they decided to launch the console through their own Sega of America subsidiary, which executed a limited launch on August 14th, 1989 in New York City and Los Angeles. The Genesis was released in the rest of North America later that year, so as it turns out, the thing they were looking for was the thing they had the entire time. Just like the main character in every other Pixar movie.
Power up!
And it was $200 with Altered Beast as the packing game. On to Europe, or the PAL region as it's called. September 1990 is when it was released, at a price of 190 Europe money or $337 equivalent. The release was handled by Virgin Mastertronic, which was later purchased in 1991 by Sega and became Sega of Europe, but they didn't buy Virgin Games or Richard Branson. The console was also bundled with Altered Beast. Sometimes.
Power up!
Same as in North America. And Japan wasn't doing packing games. I mean, Nintendo wasn't either, so it's not like that's why they weren't doing well in Japan.
History. North American sales and marketing.
I'm a North American, and this section was probably written by a North American. For the North American market, new Sega of America CEO Michael Katz instituted a two-part approach to build sales. The first part involved a marketing campaign to challenge Nintendo head-on and emphasize the more arcade-like experience available on the Genesis, with slogans including, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." Since Nintendo owned the console rights to most arcade games of the time, the second part involved creating a library of recognizable games which used the names and likenesses of celebrities and athletes such as Pat Riley basketball, Arnold Palmer tournament golf, James Buster Douglas knockout boxing, Joe Montana football, Tommy Lasorda baseball,
Third baseman. Safe.
Mario somebody or other hockey. Sorry. And Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Nonetheless, Sega struggled to overcome Nintendo's presence in consumers' homes. Tasked by Nakayama to sell 1 million units within the first year, Katz and Sega of America sold only 500,000. In mid-1990, Nakayama hired Tom Kalinske to replace Katz as CEO of Sega of America. Although Kalinske knew little about the video game market, he surrounded himself with industry-savvy advisors, a believer in the razor and blades model, which is selling one item at or below cost to boost the sales of complementary items. He developed a 4-point plan. Cut the price of the console, create an American team to develop games targeted at the American market, expand the aggressive advertising campaigns, and replace the bundled game Altered Beast with a new game, Sonic the Hedgehog. The Japanese board of directors initially disapproved of the plan, but all 4 points were approved by Nakayama, who told Kolinsky, "I hired you to make the decisions for Europe and the Americas, so go ahead and do it." Critics praised Sonic as one of the greatest games yet made, and Genesis sales increased as customers who had been waiting for the release of the international version of Nintendo's Super Famicom, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, decided to purchase a Genesis instead. Yeah, SNES didn't come out until August 23rd, 1991 in North America, just over 2 years after the Genesis, and Sonic the Hedgehog was already out.
Your boy's got legs.
There was also NEC's TurboGrafx 16, which failed to gain traction, and NEC soon pulled it out of the market. In large part due to the popularity of Sonic the Hedgehog, the Genesis outsold the Super Nintendo in the United States nearly 2-1 during the 1991 holiday season. Sega controlled 65% of the 16-bit console market in January 92, the first time Nintendo had not been the console leader since 1985. The Genesis outsold the SNES for 4 consecutive Christmases due to its 2-year lead, lower price point, and larger game library compared to the SNES. At its release, Sega had 10 games for every game on the SNES. So there's a lot of jibber jabber here, but basically Sega's lead was eroding over the years, and in the grand scheme of things, as a person who was biased towards the Genesis because I grew up with it, fought for its honor on the playground, and I just know the games better, so therefore I prefer them, usually. Knowing all that, now let me tell you how Nintendo won the console war. They kept supporting their system to make it a stronger contender over time, whereas Sega made a bunch of wrong moves when it came to attempting to add value to the system or sell you more stuff, whatever you want to call it, and then really just stopped trying in 95. So in the full layout of things, yeah, the SNES pushed beyond the Genesis, but if you bought a Genesis anytime before 94, you could feel like your console was a winner. And it could only get better because it just seemed like with every year that passed, everything was just automatically getting better. That was the 90s. And it's not like anyone was like, oh, now that Donkey Kong Country is out, I'm just gonna get an SNES and dump my Genesis. The ship had already set sail. It was up to the next console to win me over, but I was gonna switch teams halfway through. My parents had already bought my ticket. There was no switching rides in the middle of the ocean. I don't know why I'm using boat travel as a metaphor for transportation in the 90s, but just ask the people on the Titanic. They know what I'm talking about.
I don't really know.
By the way, for Christmas 98, I got an N64, so I did switch teams.
Technical specifications.
The main microprocessor is a, at the time, widely used 16 to 32-bit Motorola 68000 CPU clocked at 7.6 MHz, an 8-bit Zilog Z80 processor that controls sound hardware and provides backwards compatibility with the Master System. The Genesis has 64 kilobytes of RAM, 64 kilobytes of video RAM, and 8 kilobytes of audio RAM. It can display up to 61 colors at once from a palette of 512. The games are in ROM cartridge format and inserted in the top. The Genesis produces sound using a Texas Instruments SN76489 PSG, which is also part of the Master System backwards compatibility, which is integrated with the Video Display Processor VDP, and a Yamaha YM2612 FM synthesizer chip. And yeah, there's hardware revisions where this stuff is all shuffled around and chips are combined or cloned, but you get the point.
Peripherals.
Extra stuff you could buy. The standard controller features a rounded shape, a directional pad, 3 main buttons, and a start button. In 1993, Sega released a slightly smaller pad with 3 additional face buttons. By the way, this is the 3 and 6 button controllers. I feel like we're overly, kind of taking the long way to get into this. They started with a 3 button controller, and then optionally, you could buy a 6 button controller later. It was created because of the popularity of Street Fighter II and its use of 6 buttons in the arcade. And that's really the main reason for having a 6-button controller is fighting games. There's games that support it here and there and have little hidden features with it. And there's a bunch of other controllers, by the way. The system is backwards compatible with the Master System. The first peripheral released, the power-based converter, or Master System converter in Europe. And why they didn't call it that in America, I don't know. Power-based sounds like a Nintendo thing, but for whatever reason, the Master System was called the base system. So that's supposed to make it make sense, but it doesn't. And their packaging did little to illustrate what it did. But Would it have even mattered? Because we North Americans, future millennials, didn't know what a Master System was. After the Genesis was out for a year, they stopped advertising the Master System games in North America. So if you came into things after, there was no ads for Master System games. So whatever, it's just a pass-through to fit cards and cartridges into. It's designed for the Model 1. There's a Genesis Model 2, we'll get to that. So if you don't want to take a hacksaw to your power base, whatever, there's a Master System Converter 2 that was released only in places where people were buying Master System stuff. It works with NTSC and PAL Model 1 and 2 consoles. Other peripherals were released to add functionality. The Menacer is a wireless infrared light gun peripheral used with compatible games. In November '93, Sega released the Sega Activator, an octagonal device that lies flat on the floor and was designed to translate the player's physical movements into game inputs.
There's never been anything like this. Jump into the action with the Activator, the next level of interactive gameplay.
Just punch.
Ooh,
see?
look at that, huh?
Now punch me, Gary. Can you see
I'm
that?
trying to.
I've got him. I've got him up against the ropes.
It's all right.
Look at
Amanda
this.
comes back. Ooh.
See, isn't this great? But see, I'm moving forward, Gary. You're forgetting to move forward.
Well, wait a
So I've got you up against the ropes.
Sega!
Yeah, I'm getting you. Okay, I'm going to get you.
The device was a commercial failure due mainly to its inaccuracy and its high price point. And blah, 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 blah. There's a bunch of peripherals out there. Moving on.
Network services.
In its first foray into online gaming, Sega created Sega MegaNet, which debuted in Japan on November 3rd, 1990, operating through a cartridge and peripheral called the Mega Modem. This allowed Mega Drive players to play a total of 17 games online. And then there's that Mega Answer thing. In 1994, Sega started the Sega Channel, a game distribution system using cable television services. Using a special peripheral, Genesis players could download a game from a library of 50 each month and demos for upcoming releases. Games were downloaded to internal memory and deleted when the console was powered off. The Sega Channel reached 250,000 subscribers at its peak and ran until July 31st, 1998, well past the release of the Saturn, which was Sega's next generation console, by the way.
Game library.
A large part of the appeal of the Genesis library during the console's lifetime was the arcade-based experience of its games, as well as more difficult entries such as Eco the Dolphin and its sports games. Compared to its competition, Sega advertised to an older audience by hosting more mature games, including the uncensored version of Mortal Kombat, which you have to unlock by pressing A, B, A, C, A, B, B on a screen when the game starts. It's been a while since I played Mortal Kombat, and I was shocked at how tame this was compared to the levels of inappropriateness games of the 90s would take things. And it was with all media. It seems like parents of the 90s really mobilized on the hearsay of their children, and that just made it so being edgy was seen as the path to attention, as in being successful. In the now times, it's kind of the opposite. Unless you're talking about divisive content on social media, then yes, collective outrage still pulls in the money. One of the biggest third-party companies to support the Genesis early on was Electronic Arts. Trip Hawkins, founder and then president of EA, believed the faster drawing speeds of the Genesis made it more suitable for sports games than the SNES, and credits EA's success on the Genesis for helping catapult the EA Sports brand. Also, they had this special deal that put them above all other developers, so yada yada yada. For me, Road Rash was the standout series for EA. Just a personal opinion. Really what it comes down to is the games. The specs don't matter as much as people talk about them. Master System has generally better specs than the NES, but NES had all the games. And historically, Nintendo has the reputation of being the company that has the best games, not the best hardware. But at this point in time, people talk about the hardware a lot. And now, 30 years later, you compare these consoles to a PS5, they suck. But we're still into them, even though it seemed like we were gonna move on and forget about all that stuff. So I guess it doesn't have all that much to do with the spec sheet. Here's just a few Genesis games that have that, I guess, Genesis atmosphere. 1997, Sega of America claimed the Genesis had a software attach rate of 16 games sold per console, double that of the Super Nintendo.
Sega Virtua processor.
The Super NES can have enhancement chips inside each cartridge to produce more advanced graphics. For example, the launch game Pilot Wings, from 1990, so I guess this is North America, contains a digital signal processor. Later, the Super FX chip was designed to offload complex rendering tasks from the main CPU. It was first used in Star Fox, 1993, for real-time 3D polygons, and would continue to be used. Sega had produced such effects on its arcade platforms and adapted some to the home console by developing the Sega Virtua processor, or SVP. This chip enables the Genesis to render polygons in real time and provides an axis transformation unit that handles scaling and rotation. Virtua Racing 1994 is the only game released with this chip and the only Genesis cartridge with any enhancement chip, running at a significantly higher and more stable frame rate than filled polygon games on the Super Nintendo, so it's better than the Super FX chip, but it's also more expensive. At $100, Virtua Racing is the most expensive Genesis cartridge ever produced. By comparison, Star Fox on Super Nintendo was more like $60. Even though early polygon games aren't known for aging well, between the two, Star Fox is just a better game. I could keep playing that game. I was kind of annoyed with Virtua Racing. All the dithering and short draw distances made it hard to see what was coming up, so they made this a high-spec chip that was too expensive to justify the purchase, so it couldn't be used to make a bunch of other games that would elevate the Genesis. Two other games, Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA, were planned for the SVP chip, but were instead moved into the Saturn's launch line. Virtua Fighter 2 was released for the Genesis in '97. It's not all that impressive, but it's not bad either, and it doesn't have the SVP chip its name suggests. So they planned on selling this chip as a separate upgrade module for the Genesis, but it was canceled in order to focus its efforts on the more powerful 32X add-on. All bad ideas. Kids or parents who were sticking with the Genesis weren't looking for upgrades to buy. They just wanted new games that may or may not have ports or similar reinventions of games that existed on the Saturn, right? Master System has tons of ports from Genesis or Game Gear, but no Panzer Dragoon or Nights into Dreams for the Genesis. Yeah, you could be like, wouldn't that cannibalize Saturn sales? But then why make a 32X? If you're trying to add value to what's already there, why not just make a lock-on cartridge that's a game that works like an expansion pack game? A new game that also expands games you already own. We thought Sonic & Knuckles was just the beginning, and they never did it again.
We're never gonna make it. We'll make it.
Sonic & Knuckles arriving October 18th. Maybe.
Sega Genesis add-ons.
In addition to accessories such as the power-based converter, the Genesis supports two add-ons that each support their own game libraries. The first is the Sega CD, released October '92, known as the Mega CD in all regions except for North America. It's a compact disc-based peripheral that can play its library of games in CD-ROM format. The second is the Sega 32X, released November '94, which this is the only thing that came out in North America first, by the way. Usually stuff would come out in Japan first. It's a 32-bit peripheral which uses ROM cartridges and serves as a pass-through for Genesis games. This isn't about those, so moving on.
Console variations.
Okay, so back to that part where I was saying there are different models of the Genesis. It's designed for the Model 1. There's a Genesis Model 2. We'll get to that. This is a Model 1, but it's a late Model 1, so it doesn't say high-definition graphics, and it doesn't have the EXT port on the back for all those not very many things that were never released in North America for it. The back of the Model 1 console, which provides a radio frequency RF output port designed for use with coaxial video inputs, and a specialized 8-pin DIN port, which both provide better video and audio output. I call it the AV multiport. I'll assume other people do as well. Both those outputs produce monophonic sound, whereas a headphone jack on the front of the console produces stereo sound. Stereo TVs weren't common in 1989, so say you had a Model 1 in the 90s and you wanted stereo sound, you would have to run a 1/8 plug to RCA from the headphone jack to do that.
So you had to go to Radio Shack.
The best stuff ever.
Brought to you by Radio Shack.
Okay, so there's a Model 2 released in 1993. It's smaller and lighter, and we're gonna unceremoniously talk about that now. The DIN port, radio frequency output port, and headphone jack are replaced by a 9-pin mini DIN port on the back for composite video, RGB, and stereo sound, and the standard RF switch. So contrary to what I assumed, the Model 2 came default with an RF cable, which is where you set your TV to channel 3 or 4, and then the Genesis takes over that channel, which is what this does too. Composite video is RCA, the yellow, white, red cables. Those act as a totally new input for the TV, like Video One or whatever. But older TVs could only accept input from antenna or broadcast signal, so RF connectors were kind of like hacks. We call this the before time BV, or before VCR. It's also when John Lennon was still alive, if you want to think of it that way. But it was a gradual transition. Everyone didn't just go out and buy a new TV right after Lennon died. RCA was made for the world after VCR. AV is what they call it, so after VCR in 1993, and Genesis was still defaulting to RF. So, like the Model 1, you had to pay for this cable, but now it all connects to one port, so it makes it cheaper for them to manufacture it. And both consoles have an edge connector on the bottom right side of the console that can be connected to a peripheral. It's a Sega CD, by the way. That's all there is, unless you're a hackser. So the Model 2 was called the Mega Drive 2 in Japan and Europe, and sold as the Genesis without the Sega prefix in North America, but we call it the Model 2 anyway. In 1994, Sega released a combined semi-portable Genesis Sega CD unit, the Genesis CDX, marketed as the Multi-Mega in Europe. It was $400 in the US. This was roughly $100 more than the individual Genesis and Sega CD units put together, as the Sega CD had been reduced to $229 half a year before. The Sega CD was bundled with Sonic CD, which isn't a bad game. It's probably the best game on Sega CD, but not as good as any of the main series on Genesis. The Sega CD version of Eco the Dolphin, which is basically the Genesis game plus some new levels and some allegedly better audio, all around I prefer the Genesis version. This is too much like, hey, we added some new stuff here and there, and there's new sounds that don't match the old sounds that we've replaced. It's like, hey, we sampled real water, okay. It sounds kind of annoying. And then Sega Classics Arcade Collection. So these are Genesis games but on CD, with a few updates here and there, and downgrades too. Golden Axe is only one player now, for whatever reason, and there's some audio bugs in it, because changes were probably rushed. All that for better voice samples? That's the story of the Sega CD. Not worth it. Again, it's not all about the spec sheet. So the upsell on this combo unit is because it's a compact game system. You're paying for the small. The CDX features an LCD screen that, when the unit is used to play audio CDs, displays the current track being played. So they marketed it in part as a portable CD player. Even though, you couldn't play the games portably. Late in the 16-bit era, October 95, Sega released a handheld version of the Genesis Nomad. Its design was based on the MegaJet, a Mega Drive portable unit featured on airplane flights in Japan. It's kind of a successor to the Game Gear. It uses 6 AA batteries, has a 3.25-inch LCD screen. The Nomad supports most of the Genesis library, but cannot be used with the Sega 32X, the Sega CD, or the power-based converter. Third-party models. Is this a new section? Probably not. Let's just go with it. After the Genesis was discontinued, Majesco Entertainment released the Genesis 3 as a budget version in 1998. It's a lot smaller, but really has nothing else going for it. It was made to be as cheap as possible, and it's at the cost of reduced quality and accessory compatibility, and I wasn't even aware of it at the time.
32-bit era and beyond.
So the 32X was 32-bit, and so was their next generation console, the Saturn, released May 11th, 1995. And so was the Sony PlayStation that came out of nowhere and punched everyone in the nuts on September 1995. So during this new wave, Sega underestimated the continued popularity of the Genesis and did not have the inventory to meet demand. Kalinsky estimated that we could have sold another 300,000 Genesis systems at the end of '95. Nakayama's decision to focus on the Saturn, based on the system's relative performance in Japan, had been cited as the major contributing factor in this miscalculation. By contrast, Nintendo concentrated on the 16-bit home console market as well as its successful handheld, the Game Boy, and pulled into the lead. And this is also when they released the Virtual Boy, which is a total flop, but nobody's perfect. Following tensions with Sega Enterprises Ltd. Over its focus on the Saturn, Kalinsky, who oversaw the rise of the Genesis in 1991, grew uninterested in the business and resigned in mid-1996. By the way, the Nintendo 64 was released on September 96 in North America.
Sega Genesis Mini.
On September 19th, 2019, or 9/19/19, they do like picking dates that stand out, Sega announced a microconsole, the Genesis Mega Drive Mini. The console includes 40 games, all these games, plus 2 unreleased games, so really 42, just say it has 42 games. It has different games for different regions and save anywhere functions. Streets of Rage composer Yuzo Koshiro provided the menu music for the Sega Genesis Mini.
Reception.
As per what I feel like, I'm going to be foregoing the opinions of others and going with my own North American-centric view. You got the Sega versus Nintendo thing. You got the, well, of course, Super Nintendo was better. Just look at the specs argument. First of all, 51% of picking a team is just default exposure to that team.
16-bit 3D graphics, true digital sound, and Super Mario World.
Oh, you're right here and I don't have a team to root for? Well, then you're my team.
For Christmas, as always, nobody beats the Wiz.
So if you were first exposed to a Genesis and had a favorable experience, you would be like, I want a Genesis. Before that, I had played Nintendo, I thought Mario was great, and I knew my Atari 800 was a relic. Playing Sonic the Hedgehog and Kid Chameleon and Golden Axe, I was like, wow, I want these games. They just changed my brain and calibrated it for the expectations of this world and its ambiance of light and sound. I never played a Super Nintendo, so it was this alien thing, but when I did, I liked it. But I wasn't gonna go out and buy one, because for the most part, you can only get one of each. One computer for the house, one game console per generation, and then later one handheld console. But anyways, let's end this with a quote or whatever, something from Wikipedia. In 2014, US gamers Jeremy Parrish wrote, if the Atari generation introduced video games as a short-lived 70s fad, and the NES generation established it into an enduring obsession for the young, Sega's Genesis began pushing the medium towards something resembling its contemporary form, developing games for an older demographic, or more specifically, everybody.
Like it, Mark, where you're wrong.
Sonic! Sonic!
I'm Dr. Winston O'Boogie, otherwise known as John Lennon.